I wasn't the bride he chose, I was the one they sacrificed. The words didn't come out of my mouth, but they echoed so loudly in my head that I could barely hear the music playing in the ballroom, something soft and classical that didn't belong to a night like this, a night where everything felt too sharp, too final, like the air itself had edges. My fingers tightened around the fabric of the wedding dress, ivory silk that wasn't mine, never meant for me, tailored for someone else. Someone who had smiled sweetly this morning while handing me her place. Like it was a gift instead of a sentence, and I remember thinking how strange it was that betrayal didn't always look cruel, sometimes it looked gentle, like family, like a hand on your shoulder guiding you straight into a life you never chose. The doors opened before I was ready, before I could convince my legs to move, and suddenly everyone was looking at me, rows of polished faces and quiet whispers, men in tailored suits, women draped in diamonds that caught the chandelier light like frozen stars, and I felt small in a way I hadn't felt in years, not because of the room, but because of what waited at the end of it. Victor Moretti stood there, exactly where he was supposed to be, like this had always been the plan, like I had always been the one walking toward him, and for a second I forgot to breathe, not because he was terrifying in the way people described, but because he was calm, controlled, a kind of stillness that didn't need to prove itself, his silver hair perfectly in place, his suit dark and precise, his presence heavier than the room itself, and when his eyes found mine, they didn't soften, didn't question, they assessed, measured, decided. I took one step, then another, each one louder in my head than on the marble floor, and somewhere behind me I could feel my family watching, waiting, making sure I didn't turn back, because turning back wasn't an option anymore, not after the papers were signed, not after the debt was spoken out loud in numbers too large to argue with, not after I realized that love had never been part of this equation, only payment, only exchange. The closer I got, the clearer everything became, the distance between us shrinking until I could see the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, the kind earned through years, through decisions, through a life I couldn't begin to understand, and yet, somehow, he didn't look surprised, not even slightly, as if a different bride standing in front of him meant nothing at all. I stopped inches away, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, and when the officiant began to speak, his voice faded into the background, words about union and commitment that felt hollow against the truth pressing down on my chest, because this wasn't a union, it was a transaction, and I was the price. Victor's gaze didn't leave me, steady, unblinking, and I wondered if he expected fear, expected tears, expected the kind of quiet obedience that came with situations like this, but something in me refused to give him that, something stubborn and sharp that had survived everything leading up to this moment, and when he reached for my hand, his touch controlled, deliberate, I didn't flinch, didn't pull away, I just looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw it, the smallest flicker of curiosity, barely there, almost imagined, but enough. The officiant asked the question, the one everyone waits for, the one that seals everything, and the room held its breath, expecting a simple answer, a predictable ending. But I felt something shift inside me, quiet but undeniable, like a line being drawn where there hadn't been one before, and in that exact moment, standing in a dress that wasn't mine, in a life that wasn't mine, I made a decision that no one in that room would see coming. The silence stretched just a second too long, and in that second I realized something dangerous, something powerful. He expected an answer, but more than that, he expected a certain kind of answer, quiet, obedient, final, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room pressing against me, waiting for me to fall into place like a piece that had already been decided, but I did not move, I did not lower my gaze. I did not give him what he thought he had already bought. The officiant cleared his throat softly, repeating the question, slower this time, as if giving me a chance to catch up, to correct whatever hesitation he believed he was witnessing, but I was not confused, I was choosing, and for the first time since this night began, my heartbeat felt steady instead of frantic. Victor's fingers remained around mine, firm but not forcing, and that was when I noticed it again, the control, not just over the room, but over himself. A man who did not rush, did not react without purpose, and yet, there was a shift now, subtle but real, like he was waiting to see if I would break or become something else entirely. I inhaled slowly, the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume filling my lungs, grounding me, and when I finally spoke, My voice did not shake, not even a little. "Before I answer," I said, and the words cut through the room sharper than I expected, drawing attention in a way silence never could. "I want to make something clear," and I felt the ripple move outward, the quiet confusion, the surprise, because this was not how this moment was supposed to go. Victor's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he was adjusting to a variable he had not calculated, and for a brief second, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything I could name, but enough to tell me I had his attention completely now. I turned my hand slightly in his, not pulling away, just enough to feel the balance between us, and continued, "I understand what this is," I said, keeping my voice even. "I understand the agreement, the debt, and the reason I am standing here instead of someone else." I did not look back at my family, I did not need to, their presence was already a weight I had carried into this room. "But I am not something you purchased." The words landed harder than I expected, and I felt the air change, not dramatically, but enough that it was impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the room, someone shifted, a chair moved slightly against marble, a quiet sound that felt louder than it should have, but Victor did not move, did not interrupt, did not tighten his grip. He simply watched me, and that was the moment I understood something else, something just as important. He wanted to see where this would go. "So if you want my answer," I said, meeting his gaze directly, refusing to look away, "you will hear it on my terms." The audacity of it surprised even me, but I did not stop, could not stop now that the words had started, not as payment, not as an obligation, but as a choice. The last word hung there, fragile and heavy at the same time, because everyone in that room knew exactly how little choice I had been given, and yet I said it anyway. For the first time since I walked down that aisle, Victor's expression changed in a way that was impossible to miss, not anger, not amusement, something sharper, something more alert, like he had just realized the situation in front of him was not as simple as it had seemed. And when he finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, it carried something new beneath it, something that felt almost like interest. "Then choose," he said, and the two words settled between us like a challenge instead of a command, and in that moment, I knew this was no longer just about surviving the life I had been forced into, this was about rewriting it entirely. His words did not sound like permission, they sounded like a test, and I felt it settle deep in my chest, heavy and undeniable. Because for the first time since this began, the outcome was no longer scripted, no longer guaranteed, and that was more dangerous than anything I had walked into tonight. I could feel the room leaning in, the quiet tension stretching tighter with every second I did not answer, and I knew they were waiting for me to correct myself, to step back into the role they had written for me, but something inside me had already shifted too far to return. I tightened my grip on his hand just enough to steady myself, then released it slowly, deliberately, letting the movement speak before I did, and I saw it again, that flicker in his eyes, sharper now, like he was cataloging every detail, every deviation from expectation. I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the room without losing him completely, and for a moment I considered what would be easier, what would end this quickly, what would make everything quiet again, but easy had never been what brought me here, and quiet had never protected me. When I faced him fully again, I felt something settle into place, not confidence, not exactly, but something steadier than fear, something that did not need approval to exist. "I will marry you," I said, and I heard the subtle shift ripple through the room, the release of breath, the quiet satisfaction of a story returning to its expected path, but I did not stop, not this time, but not like this, and the second half of the sentence cut through whatever relief had just formed, sharper than the first. Victor's head tilted just slightly, not confused, not offended, but attentive in a way that made everything else feel distant, like we were the only two people in a room that suddenly did not matter. "This is not a ceremony," I continued, my voice steady, even as my pulse pressed hard against my ribs. "This is a transaction disguised as one, and I will not pretend otherwise." The words were bold, maybe too bold, but they felt true in a way nothing else had tonight. Somewhere behind me, I heard a sharp inhale, someone reacting, someone realizing this was no longer a quiet arrangement, but I did not turn, did not break, because if I did, I would lose whatever fragile control I had just taken. "If I say yes," I added, meeting his gaze without hesitation, "it will be because I choose to stand here. Not because I was placed here, the distinction felt small and enormous at the same time, and I wondered if he would dismiss it, if he would end this with a single word the way someone like him could, but he did not move, did not interrupt, did not correct me. The silence stretched again, thicker now, filled with something new, something that felt less like expectation and more like anticipation, and I realized then that this moment was no longer about approval from anyone else in the room. It was about him, about whether he would accept a version of this arrangement that did not fit neatly into control. Victor stepped closer, not enough to invade, just enough to shift the space between us, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but somehow more present than before. "You are asking to redefine terms," he said, and it was not a question, it was an observation, precise and measured. I held his gaze, refusing to soften. "I am stating them," I replied, and for the briefest second, something changed in his expression again, something that looked almost like approval, but sharper, more dangerous, like respect that came with consequences. The officiant stood frozen beside us, forgotten, the ceremony suspended in a way no one had planned, and I realized that whatever happened next would not just decide how this night ended, it would decide what this entire arrangement became, and whether I would be something owned, or something he would have to learn to face. The air did not move, not even a little, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe, and for a moment I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had pushed past something invisible that could not be undone. But then Victor did something no one else expected. He smiled, not fully, not warmly, but enough to shift the entire balance of the moment. It was not the kind of smile that reassured. It was the kind that acknowledged, like he had just found something rare in a place he did not expect to look, and when his gaze sharpened on me again, it felt different, no longer just measuring, but engaging. "Very well," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something that felt like acceptance wrapped in challenge. "Then we will proceed on your terms," and the words landed heavier than anything he had said before, not because of their volume, but because of what they implied. That he was willing to bend, at least slightly, for a woman he had only just met. I felt a subtle shift ripple through the room, confusion, disbelief, the quiet discomfort of people watching power behave in a way they did not understand, and I knew this was not how things were supposed to go, not for someone like him, not for someone like me. The officiant blinked, clearly unsure how to continue, his hands tightening around the small book in front of him as if it could offer guidance. But Victor did not look away from me, did not break the moment, and after a second, the man cleared his throat and resumed, his voice a little less certain than before. The words came again, the same question, the same expectation, but this time it felt different, not because of the ceremony, but because of the choice behind it, and when I answered, I did not hesitate. "Yes," I said, simple, clear, deliberate, and for the first time, it felt like it belonged to me. The rest of it passed in a blur of controlled movements and quiet acknowledgments, rings exchanged, words repeated, but nothing about it felt traditional, nothing about it felt soft or romantic. It felt like something being rewritten in real time, something neither of us fully understood yet. When it was done, when the final words were spoken and the room began to release the tension it had been holding, Victor did not step back, did not turn away to greet guests or acknowledge the people who had gathered for this moment. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, his attention fixed on me as if everything else had already faded into background noise. "You have changed the structure of this arrangement," he said quietly, low enough that no one else could hear, and I felt the weight of his words settle into something more personal, more direct. "Do you understand what that means?" It was not a warning, not exactly, but it carried the kind of weight that made it impossible to ignore. I held his gaze, refusing to let the moment shrink me back into something smaller. "It means I am not something you control," I replied, just as quietly, and for a second, the space between us tightened, not with conflict, but with recognition. His eyes searched mine, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a depth that suggested he was looking for something specific, something real, and whatever he found there made him exhale slowly, almost imperceptibly, like he had reached a conclusion he had not expected. "No," he said after a pause, his voice softer now, but no less certain, "it means you are something I will have to understand," and the difference between those two things settled over me in a way I could not fully explain, because understanding required attention, required effort, required something far more complex than ownership. Around us, the room had begun to move again, quiet conversations resuming, people adjusting back into their roles as if nothing unusual had happened, but I knew better. I knew something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by them, not by him, not even by me, and as Victor finally turned slightly, gesturing for me to walk beside him instead of behind, I realized that this was no longer a story about being forced into someone else's world. It was about what happened when that world did not behave the way it was supposed to. The doors opened before anyone announced it, and the shift from ceremony to movement felt immediate, like the room itself had been waiting for permission to breathe again, conversations rising in low, controlled waves as Victor stepped forward and I moved beside him, not behind, never behind, and I could feel the difference in every glance that followed us, subtle but unmistakable, like they were recalculating something they thought they already understood. His hand rested lightly at the small of my back, not guiding, not forcing, just present, and I noticed the restraint in it, the deliberate control, like even that small contact was something he chose carefully rather than assumed, and for reasons I could not explain, that unsettled me more than anything else had tonight. We walked through the crowd slowly, people stepping aside without being asked, their voices lowering as we passed, and I realized this was not just respect, it was awareness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who holds power in a room without needing it to be announced. You handled that well, Victor said quietly as we moved, his tone neutral but not dismissive, and I turned my head just enough to look at him, searching for something in his expression, approval, irritation, anything that would define where I stood now, but all I found was focus, sharp and steady. I handled it honestly, I replied, keeping my voice just as controlled, and for a second, I thought I saw it again, that almost smile, the one that never fully formed but lingered just enough to leave a mark. He did not respond immediately, and that silence felt intentional, like he was weighing something, not my words, but what they meant long-term, and I understood then that whatever I had done back there had not just affected the moment, it had changed how he would approach everything that came after. We reached the far side of the room where the noise softened slightly, the crowd thinning into smaller clusters, and Victor paused, turning to face me fully for the first time since the ceremony ended, his attention complete, undivided. Like everything else had been set aside. You understand that most people in your position would have chosen silence, he said, not as criticism, but as fact, and I felt the weight of that truth settle between us, because he was right. Silence would have been easier, safer, expected. Most people were not standing where I was, I answered, and I meant more than just the room, more than just the moment. I meant the years that led here, the quiet decisions that had shaped who I became long before. Tonight, his gaze held mine for a long second, longer than necessary, longer than comfortable, but I did not look away, and something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that I felt it, like a line moving slightly out of place. No, he said finally, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than before. They were not, and there was something in the way he said it that felt less like agreement and more like acknowledgement, like he was beginning to see me not as part of an arrangement, but as something separate from it. A server approached cautiously, offering a glass of champagne on a silver tray, and Victor took one without looking away from me, then handed it to me instead of keeping it for himself, a small gesture, almost insignificant, but it carried a kind of intention that made it feel larger than it was. Tonight was not what you expected, he continued, finally breaking the intensity just enough to allow the moment to breathe, and it will not be what others expect either. And I understood immediately that he was not talking about the ceremony anymore, he was talking about everything that would follow. I took the glass from him, the cool surface grounding in my hand, and nodded once, not as agreement, but as recognition, because I already knew that whatever came next would not follow any pattern I had seen before, not his, not mine, and as the noise of the room slowly returned around us, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider until now. I had not just stepped into his world, I had changed the way it would have to respond to me. The glass felt colder than I expected, the condensation slipping lightly against my fingers as I held it without drinking, and for a moment I focused on that instead of everything else, the noise, the movement, the weight of what had just happened settling slowly into something real. Victor turned slightly, acknowledging a man approaching from the left, someone older, polished, with the kind of confidence that came from standing close to power without ever challenging it, and I watched as they exchanged a few quiet words, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, but I noticed the way the man's eyes flicked toward me more than once, curious, measuring, like I had already become part of a conversation I had not been invited into. "Congratulations," the man said finally, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and I nodded in return, keeping my expression neutral, because I could already tell that in this world, reactions were currency, and I had no intention of spending mine too freely. Victor's hand returned to my back as the man stepped away, and this time the gesture felt different, not guiding, not even grounding, but almost like a signal, subtle and deliberate, and I realized he was not just acknowledging me, he was presenting me, not as something owned, but as something that would need to be recognized. We moved again, slower now, the room shifting around us as more people approached, brief introductions, controlled conversations. Each one revealing a little more about the world I had stepped into, not through what was said, but through what was left unsaid, the pauses, the glances, the careful choice of words that never fully explained anything but still carried meaning. I listened more than I spoke, answering when necessary, observing always, and I could feel it building, the quiet awareness that I was not reacting the way they expected, not shrinking, not fading into the background, and that alone seemed to unsettle them more than anything else. At one point, a woman in a pale silver dress approached, her posture flawless, her smile practiced, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but precise. "You must be quite adaptable," she said. And I understood immediately that it was not a compliment, not entirely, but I met her gaze without hesitation. "I prefer intentional," I replied, and for a second, her expression shifted, just slightly, before she recovered, nodding as if that answer fit into whatever conclusion she had already started forming. When she left, I felt Victor's attention return to me fully, and I did not need to look to know he had noticed, because he noticed everything. That much was already clear. "You are learning quickly," he said, his tone low, almost thoughtful, and I turned my head just enough to meet his gaze again, steady, unyielding. "I have always paid attention," I answered, and the truth of it settled between us in a way that felt heavier than the words themselves. The music shifted, something slower now, more deliberate, and the lights dimmed just enough to change the mood of the room, but nothing about this felt like celebration, not in the way most weddings did. It felt like transition, like something closing and something else beginning at the same time. Victor studied me for a moment longer, then extended his hand, not as a demand, not as an expectation, but as an invitation, simple and direct, and I hesitated only for a second before placing my hand in his, because I understood what this was, not just a dance, but another moment, another test, another chance to define how this would move forward. As we stepped onto the floor, the space around us clearing almost instinctively, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to admit until now. This was no longer about surviving the situation I had been placed in, this was about navigating it on my own terms, step by step, decision by decision, and whether he realized it or not, he had already agreed to play by those rules. The moment his hand closed around mine, I felt it, not control, not pressure, but precision, like every movement he made had already been calculated 3 steps ahead, and when we stepped onto the floor, the music seemed to shift around us, slower, heavier, each note stretching just enough to make every second feel intentional. His other hand rested lightly at my waist, careful, controlled, never crossing a line that had not been clearly drawn, and that restraint said more than any force ever could, because it meant he was choosing to hold back, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. I followed his lead at first, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand it, the rhythm, the structure, the way he moved through space like it already belonged to him, and I realized quickly that this was not just a dance, it was a language, one he spoke fluently, one he expected others to follow without question. But I did not stay passive for long. I adjusted, matched his pace, then shifted it slightly, just enough to see if he would notice, and of course he did, his hand tightening just a fraction, not to correct me, but to acknowledge the change, and for the first time since we stepped onto the floor, I saw it clearly, interest, real and undeniable. "You are not afraid," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it disappeared beneath the music, and I let a small breath escape, not quite a laugh, Not quite anything defined, I answered honestly, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise, but fear is not the same as surrender. The words felt steady as they left me, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. His gaze sharpened, not in challenge, but in recognition, and I felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable, like a line moving just slightly out of place. Around us, the room had begun to watch more closely. Conversations fading into background noise as attention gathered, not loudly, not obviously, but enough that I could feel it, the quiet pull of curiosity, because this was not what they expected to see, not from him, not from me. I moved with him again, this time not following, but responding, matching his steps with intention instead of hesitation, and the difference was immediate, the space between us changing from controlled to balanced, not equal, not yet, but no longer one-sided. Most people would be careful, he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful now, like he was speaking more to the situation than to me, and I tilted my head slightly, meeting his gaze without breaking rhythm. I am being careful, I replied, and the truth of it settled between us, because this was not recklessness, this was precision, this was choosing every word, every movement, every pause. His expression shifted again, that almost smile returning, sharper this time, more defined, and I realized then that this was not just surprising him, it was engaging him, pulling him into something he had not planned for, something that required more than control to navigate. The music slowed further, the final note stretching into something softer, and as the dance came to an end, his hand did not drop immediately, did not release me the way it should have. Instead, he held the moment just a second longer, long enough to make it clear that this was not over, not even close. You are changing the rules, he said quietly, and I felt the weight of it settle into something real, something lasting, and I met his gaze without hesitation, steady, certain. No, I replied, my voice calm, deliberate. I am showing you they were never fixed to begin with, and for the first time since this night began. The silence that followed did not feel heavy, it felt open, like something new had just been set into motion and neither of us was willing to step away from it. The music faded, but the silence it left behind did not feel empty, it felt charged, like the room was waiting to see what would happen next, and when Victor finally released my hand, the absence of his touch lingered longer than it should have, not because of the contact itself, but because of what it represented, a moment where neither of us had followed the script we were supposed to. The crowd resumed its quiet rhythm around us, conversations picking up again, but there was a difference now. A subtle shift in the way people looked at us. At me, less dismissal, more attention, and I understood that something had changed, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to alter how I would be seen from this point forward. Victor did not step away immediately, instead he studied me for a second longer, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that felt more deliberate than before, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quieter tone, something less formal, more direct. Walk with me, he said, not as a command, but as a decision already made, and I followed without hesitation, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see where this would lead. We moved through a side corridor just beyond the main ballroom, the noise dimming behind us with each step until it became a distant echo, replaced by the softer sounds of the building itself, footsteps against polished floors, the faint hum of air conditioning, the quiet space offering something the main room could not, privacy. When we stopped, it was near a set of tall windows overlooking the city, light stretching out in every direction, distant and steady, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the pause settling into something that did not feel uncomfortable, just unhurried. You disrupted an entire room without raising your voice, Victor said finally, his tone thoughtful, almost analytical, and I leaned slightly against the cool glass behind me, grounding myself in the stillness. I said what needed to be said, I replied, and the simplicity of it felt more powerful than anything more complicated could have been. He watched me carefully, not searching for weakness, but for consistency, like he was trying to understand whether what he had seen was a moment or a pattern, and I realized that this was the real shift, not the ceremony, not the dance, but this quiet evaluation happening without an audience. Most people would call that risky, he continued, and I let out a small breath. Not dismissive, just honest. Most people are trying to protect something, I answered, meeting his gaze again. I was already given away, the truth of it settled between us, heavier than anything else I had said tonight, because it was not defiance, it was clarity. For a second, something in his expression softened, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see it, a recognition that went beyond the situation, beyond the arrangement, something more human than I expected from a man like him. He stepped closer then, not abruptly, not invading, just enough to narrow the space between us, and I felt the shift again, not threatening, not overwhelming, but present in a way that demanded awareness. You believe that gives you nothing to lose, he said quietly, and I held his gaze, steady, unflinching. No, I replied, my voice calm, certain. It means I decide what is worth keeping. The distinction felt important, more important than anything else we had said so far, because it defined everything that would come next. His eyes held mine for a long second, longer than before, and I could see it clearly now, not just interest, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something that suggested he was no longer looking at this as a simple arrangement, but as something far more unpredictable. Outside the window, the city lights continued without pause, steady and distant, and I realized that whatever this had started as, whatever it had been meant to be, it was no longer contained within those expectations. It had already shifted into something neither of us had planned, and as Victor finally spoke again, his voice lower, more certain, I understood that he had reached the same conclusion. Then we will see, he said, and the words did not feel like an ending, they felt like the beginning of something neither of us could walk away from. The words lingered between us, quiet but final, and for a moment neither of us moved, as if stepping away would mean losing something neither of us fully understood yet, and I realized then that this was not just a conversation, it was a shift, something subtle but irreversible that had already begun to reshape everything around it. Victor turned slightly, his gaze moving past me toward the glass, toward the city stretching endlessly beyond the window, and I followed his line of sight, watching the lights flicker in the distance, each one steady, each one part of something larger. Something structured, controlled, and I wondered how many of those lights existed because of men like him, men who built worlds that operated beneath the surface of everything else. You realize, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more reflective than before, that this changes more than just tonight, and I did not answer immediately, not because I did not understand, but because I did, completely, and I needed a second to decide how much of that understanding I was willing to show. I turned back to him slowly, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness I had held all evening, and nodded once, deliberate. I know, I said, simple, direct, because anything more would have diluted the truth of it. His eyes held mine for a second longer, searching again, not for weakness, but for hesitation, and when he did not find it, something settled in his expression, not resignation, not acceptance, but something closer to decision. Then you also understand, he continued, his tone sharpening just slightly, that this will not be simple, and I felt the weight of that statement, not as a warning, but as a reality, one that extended far beyond this room, beyond this night, into something much larger than either of us had spoken out loud. I let out a small breath, steady, controlled, and allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips, not out of defiance, but out of clarity. Simple was never an option, I replied, and for the first time since this began, the words felt less like resistance and more like alignment, like I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me, but actively stepping into what would come next. He watched me for a moment longer, and I could see it clearly now, not just curiosity, not just interest, but something deeper, something that suggested he was beginning to understand that whatever arrangement he thought he had secured, it was no longer defined by control alone. The sound of distant voices drifted faintly from the ballroom, a reminder that the world outside this moment was still moving, still expecting, still watching, and I knew we could not stay here forever, not in this quiet space where everything felt too clear, too unguarded. Victor straightened slightly, the shift subtle but intentional, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same controlled authority, but now layered with something new, something that felt less like command and more like partnership. We leave in 10 minutes, he said, not as a question, but not as an order either, and I understood immediately what he meant, not just the physical departure, but the transition that would follow, the move from public performance to private reality. I nodded once, accepting the statement for what it was, and for a brief second, neither of us moved, the silence settling into something almost calm, almost steady, like the beginning of a rhythm we had not yet learned but were already starting to follow. As we turned back toward the hallway, the sounds of the ballroom growing louder with each step, I felt it fully for the first time, not fear, not uncertainty, but awareness, sharp and undeniable, that whatever this had started as, whatever it had been meant to be, it was no longer a story about being chosen or given away, it was a story about what happened when someone refused to be defined by either. And as the doors came back into view, the light spilling out into the corridor, I realized something else, something that settled deep and certain in my chest. He may have brought me into his world, but from this moment on, I would decide how it changed.